It was just after midnight when the Pacific Rim shuddered. 20 earthquakes in a single night, volcanic ash billowing from Alaska to Indonesia, alarms activating from Chile to Japan. Scientists now warn that the Ring of Fire, Earth's most volatile tectonic frontier, is not just restless, but actively reawakening. Over 800 million people live along this 40,000-kilometer arc. What exactly triggered this sudden surge, and how close are we to another catastrophic megathrust event? The answers begin in a place few have ever seen: the fault lines beneath Kamchatka. Beneath the cold waters east of Kamchatka, the crust did not simply slip, it tore open. The rupture stretched more than 400 kilometers along the subduction interface, a scar running from the deep trench toward the Okhotsk coast. In the first seconds, seismic waves radiated outward, but the real drama was hidden at depth, where rock masses shifted by as much as 23 meters. That is the length of a city bus, moved in one violent, silent motion. Modelers at the Russian Seismological Bulletin and the USGS pieced together the event from a web of seismic stations and offshore sensors. Their finite fault inversions revealed a rupture that began near Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky and traveled predominantly southwest, hugging the shallowest part of the plate boundary. Most of the slip concentrated within the upper 20 to 35 kilometers of the crust, close enough to the seafloor to deform the ocean bottom, but not everywhere breaking through to the surface. The rupture took 4.5 minutes to run its course. It was an unusually slow event for its size, outlasting even the infamous Mal earthquake in Chile. Slip was not uniform. The largest displacement, over 23 meters, occurred northeast of the main shock starting point, then tapered both toward the deep mantle wedge and up toward the trench. GPS and INSAR measurements later confirmed more than 4 meters of horizontal movement and up to 1.5 meters of coastal uplift in some areas. Along the trench, a sharp offset of nearly 5 meters suggested splay faulting, where secondary faults near the surface broke away from the main interface, amplifying the deformation. Waveform analysis and directivity studies told the story of a rupture that moved mostly in one direction, southwest, with a modest up-dip splay near the northern edge. The moment tensor solutions from the USGS, the Japan Meteorological Agency, and Russian networks all pointed to a low-angle thrust, typical of subduction megathrusts. Aftershocks clustered along the shallow interface and on upper plate faults, tracing the boundaries of the main slip patch. For the scientists decoding these signals, each data point sharpened the picture of a fault under enormous strain, now partially released. The rupture's geometry, its slip distribution, and its slow, persistent propagation all became clues in understanding how the world's largest earthquakes unfold in the hidden dark beneath the Pacific. 15 minutes after the rupture, a DART station anchored in the Northwest Pacific recorded a tsunami crest rising 4.1 meters above the deep ocean baseline. That wave, invisible to ships passing overhead, raced outward at jetliner speed, its energy mapped in real time by a network of pressure sensors and satellite uplinks. Along the Kamchatka coast, GPS and INSAR arrays confirmed more than 4 meters of horizontal shift and, in some bays, up to 1.5 meters of sudden uplift, enough to strand fishing boats and redraw the shoreline in a single tide cycle. Static Coulomb stress calculations revealed a lobe of increased pressure, peaking at plus 1.1 bar, extending southwest from the main rupture. Within hours, aftershocks clustered along this stress corridor, with magnitudes climbing above local background. The deformation wasn't uniform. Some segments along the trench showed abrupt vertical offsets, while others flexed without breaking, highlighting the complexity of shallow megathrust slip. For scientists, the sensor network became the silent witness. Each DART transmission, each GPS data point, sharpened the evolving static stress map, an invisible force field that now stretched toward the Kuriil arc. Field teams surveyed the new coastal topography, measuring uplifted wharves and newly exposed reefs, while digital models projected the altered hazard landscape. The tsunami's deepwater crest, the measured uplift, and the mapped stress lobe together revealed the raw physics of rupture, showing how energy released in one segment can load the next. In the hours after the quake, The immediate aftermath was not just destruction, but a measurable reshaping of the region, signals that would ripple outward, carrying both warning and uncertainty for the wider Pacific Rim. In the fishing towns along Chile's Coquimbo coast, the memory of the 2015 Illapel earthquake is never far from daily life. On September 16th of that year, the ground shook for more than 3 minutes, sending families scrambling uphill in the dark as tsunami sirens echoed across the bay. The water reached inland, flooding streets and leaving boats stranded far above the tide line. In the aftermath, something changed in how these communities faced their future. Local volunteers, school teachers, and neighborhood councils began organizing regular evacuation drills. Once a year became twice, then every few months. Groups mapped out the fastest routes to high ground, marked meeting points with painted signs, and handed out printed instructions door to door. WhatsApp groups sprang up, linking residents across blocks for real-time alerts. Instead of waiting for distant authorities, neighbors checked on each other, especially the elderly and those living closest to the water. Evacuation became a community practice. Pressure grew for better warning systems. Parents lobbied municipal leaders for more sirens, arguing that seconds count when the next wave comes. By 2023, new sirens dotted the coastline, funded by a mix of local fundraising and government grants. Children practiced evacuation routines in schoolyards, while fishermen kept radios tuned to civil defense bulletins. Sirens and routines became part of everyday life. For many, preparedness had become a part of daily life, a habit shaped by hard experience. The lessons of Illapel did not fade with the aftershocks. Instead, they seeded a culture of self-reliance and vigilance, where readiness is not just a policy but a shared commitment. In these coastal towns, the next earthquake is a question of when, not if. But the answer, they insist, will not be left to chance. On March 19, 2022, a slow, silent shift began beneath the seafloor off Hachinohe in northeast Japan. GPS sensors in the GeoNet network picked up the movement, barely 2 centimeters spread over days, but unmistakable. By March 26th, the slip had peaked, the crust stilling again as quietly as it had moved. For most residents, life continued undisturbed, but in the city council chambers, the data set off immediate concern. The memory of 2011 lingered, a tsunami that arrived faster than warnings, overwhelming coastal defenses and changing the city forever. At the April 19th council session, officials from the Seismic Disaster Countermeasures Office presented the GeoNet data. They laid out the risk. Slow slip events like this one can redistribute stress along the subduction boundary, sometimes foreshadowing larger quakes or changing tsunami hazard in unpredictable ways. The council debated a proposal for a new GPS-based tsunami buoy designed to detect subtle offshore movement and relay real-time alerts. Budget was tight, but the urgency was clear. Survivor testimony from the 2011 disaster, delivered in person and referenced in the meeting, underscored the cost of hesitation. The vote passed 29-2. 45 million yen was allocated for the new buoy, with procurement set to begin in May and full deployment by November. Within hours, Hachinohe had moved from scientific observation to actionable policy, closing a critical warning gap exposed by the slow slip. Local news ran headlines praising the city's speed, and national agencies cited Hachinohe as a model for translating geodetic signals into public safety measures. For the people living along this stretch of coast, the decision offered more than reassurance. It delivered a tangible layer of protection, built not on fear, but on the quiet urgency of data and memory. In Indonesia, the promise of early warning often dissolves into silence. Along the Sunda and Flores arcs, pressure builds beneath the earth and inside government offices alike. The DART buoy network, crucial for detecting tsunamis in real time, has been riddled with outages since 2018. Some buoys vanished in storms, others were vandalized or left unrepaired as budget disputes dragged on. In July 2025, as Liwa Tobi Laki Laki erupted, sending an ash column soaring 11 miles into the sky, the offshore detection grid was still incomplete. Scientists at PVMBG, Indonesia's geological agency traded urgent emails with ministry officials, warning that gaps in coverage left millions exposed. Yet technical reports stalled in a maze of bureaucratic hurdles and contractor disagreements. During the 2018 Palu disaster, the absence of functional offshore sensors meant the tsunami struck with almost no warning. Hundreds died within minutes. Since then, public advocates and local researchers have pressed for full restoration of the DART system. Internal documents show ongoing arguments over who should fund repairs, whether BMKG, the meteorological agency, or private contractors. In the meantime, pressure from below continues to rise. Liwotobi Laki-Laki's eruption forced the evacuation of thousands, but without real-time ocean data, there was no way to know if a collapse or underwater landslide might trigger a sudden wave. For residents along the coast, the stakes are measured in seconds. When sensors go dark, so does the line between safety and disaster. The warning vacuum in Indonesia is not just a technical failure, it is a life and death gap shaped by policy choices and the limits of preparedness. Each missing buoy is a silent risk, waiting for the next signal from the deep. On a cold night in early 2021, the monitors at the Alaska Volcano Observatory flickered with simultaneous warnings. 3 volcanoes, Pavlov, Semisopochnoi, and Cleveland, had all begun to stir at once. The interim director, Dr. David Schneider, was already on call, but as tremor signals multiplied, the Slack channel for the night shift team filled with urgent tags. Satellite feeds streamed in real time, showing a sudden spike in thermal emissions at Semisopochnoi and a plume of ash rising from Pavlov's summit. Cleveland, further west, registered a rapid sequence of shallow quakes, each one flagged by the automated alert system. In the control room, the team faced a challenge that no protocol had anticipated. 3 volcanoes, hundreds of kilometers apart, all entering heightened unrest within hours. The standard workflow, 1 analyst per volcano, manual data pulls, phone alerts, couldn't keep pace. As the night deepened, the team switched to a new emergency protocol, pulling all available staff into a single cloud-based dashboard. Live INSAR deformation maps, satellite ash detection, seismic traces, and wind models were integrated into a single view, accessible from any terminal. For the first time, the observatory's data streams were routed through a cloud workflow, allowing remote analysts to monitor, annotate, and escalate alerts in real time. By 4 a.m., with Pavlov's ash cloud reaching over 20,000 feet and Semisopochnoi tremor intensifying, Dr. Schneider authorized a red alert for aviation. Internal emails from that night described the strain: analysts working double shifts, field teams on standby, and a flurry of coordination with the Anchorage Air Traffic Center. In the aftermath, the event triggered a complete review of the observatory's protocols. The cloud-based dashboard, improvised in crisis, became the new standard. For the scientists and technicians inside the observatory, that night was a turning point, a moment when adaptation under pressure became the only option, and the limits of old systems were exposed by the reality of simultaneous volcanic unrest. On the coast of the Pacific Northwest, the trunks of ancient trees stand in saltwater marshes, ghost forests killed when the ground suddenly dropped and the tide rushed in. These trees are silent witnesses to the last great rupture of the Cascadia subduction zone, an event that struck on January 26, 1700. The evidence is written into the landscape: layers of tsunami sand buried beneath forests, ring patterns in the drowned timber, and across the ocean, meticulous Japanese records describing an orphan tsunami that arrived with no warning 10 hours after midnight. Scientists have pieced together the timing from these clues, confirming that a magnitude 8 or 9 earthquake shook the entire Cascadia margin that night, sending a wave across the Pacific. Paleoseismic research has gone further, extracting cores from coastal marshes and lake beds to reconstruct a timeline of past ruptures. Each layer of sand, each sudden drop in soil marks a previous earthquake. By counting these layers, researchers have built a record stretching back thousands of years. The average interval between major Cascadia earthquakes is about 550 years, but the gaps are irregular, sometimes as short as 300 years, sometimes as long as 1,000 years. The last event, in 1700, puts the region more than 320 years into the current cycle. Statistically, the probability of a megathrust earthquake in Cascadia within the next 50 years is estimated at roughly 15%. That number does not predict a date, but it does frame the risk for cities like Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver, where millions live atop soft ground and alongside aging infrastructure. Urban planners and emergency managers use these probabilities as a foundation for hazard assessment, not as a countdown. The ghost forests and tsunami deposits do not offer precise warnings, but they leave no doubt about the reality of the threat. In a region where the next rupture could come with little to no warning, the lessons of 1700 and the paleo-seismic clock serve as both a scientific record and a quiet reminder. The forces that shape the coastline are still active, and the interval between disasters is measured not in memory, but in centuries of accumulated strain. Tsunami models for the Pacific Rim are haunted by one number: 10 minutes. In the most vulnerable coastal zones, northern Chile, northeast Japan, the Aleutians, and parts of Indonesia, tsunami waves can reach shore in less time than it takes to issue a formal alert. For scientists inside regional warning centers, this is not a theoretical problem. It is a countdown that begins the instant a rupture is detected. On January 14, 2023, as seismic stations logged a swarm of 20 quakes around the ring, alert teams in Tokyo, Jakarta, and Honolulu exchanged over 60 messages in a 6-hour window. Translation delays and data dropouts meant that some communities received conflicting advisories while others heard nothing at all. In Indonesia, 2 offshore sensors lost contact mid-sequence, leaving entire stretches of coastline blind to incoming waves. Japan's meteorological agency hesitated to issue a tsunami warning for a quake outside its national waters, while Hawaii's center opted for a blanket monitoring advisory, unsure whether evacuation was warranted. The debate over static versus dynamic stress transfer adds another layer of uncertainty. Some researchers argue that static stress changes, measured in bars or fractions thereof, can load adjacent faults, raising the odds of a near-term quake. Others point to dynamic triggering, where shaking from one event travels through the crust, nudging distant faults or even volcanoes toward failure. But neither model can predict with certainty which segment will fail next, or when. The only consensus is that stress does not stay put. It moves, sometimes quietly, sometimes with devastating speed. Inside the U.S. Senate Commerce Committee, the struggle over preparedness funding plays out in quieter but equally consequential ways. In 2021, an amendment to the Tsunami Warning, Education, and Research Act was shelved after business groups lobbied against regulatory costs. The result was that funds earmarked for new dart buoys and seismic upgrades in the Pacific Northwest were quietly redirected to generic emergency services. That decision, buried in committee notes, left gaps in monitoring networks that persist to this day. For the staff in alert centers, the reality is stark. The difference between a warning and a disaster is measured in minutes, sometimes less. When a rupture occurs offshore, there is rarely time for debate. The wave is already moving. The warning gap is not just a technical limitation, it is a direct reflection of policy, funding, and the relentless physics of a planet in motion. In the Pacific, the margin for error is measured in lives. Right now, nearly 800 million people live within reach of the ring's shifting plates. Early warning systems strain against the sheer speed and scale of change, and scientific consensus remains unsettled. The ground beneath us isn't just history, it's a living system, always moving. In a world built on restless fault lines, preparedness isn't a choice, it's the only certainty. Share your perspective below.